everyone, and welcome back to the Created Mind podcast, where we discuss psychology and its influence on culture from a Christian perspective. This is my first podcast back from my maternity leave, and I'm very happy to be back discussing these important ideas. My baby was born healthy. She's such a blessing, and I'm very thankful to have her. Today we're going to be discussing the book Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier. This was a book that I read before I went on maternity leave. It was so interesting to me, and I think a very important book. It made a lot of waves. I intended to do this book review long ago when it had first come out and there was a lot of buzz going on. That didn't happen because I was super pregnant and really struggling. I'm sure that you can have some empathy for me, those of you out there. But better late than never. This book has continued to stay in my mind, and I've really wanted to get these ideas out there because I think she hits on a lot of points that resonate with me, that I also have frustrations with the role that therapy plays in our culture and in our lives. However, I think that there's some ways that she maybe goes a little bit too far, some areas where she may not understand some of the underlying things that are going on in the biz. And so I'd like to offer some engagement with the things that I really enjoyed about her book and also some of her criticisms. So I'm going to start out firstly with her main points and the things that I really appreciated about what she was saying. And then I'm going to end with some criticisms as well. So let's get straight into it. So first of all, her main point in the whole book is that therapy can actually harm people instead of helping them. And that's something that we understand in the physical medical side of things. We can see that there are treatments out there. There are drugs, there are surgeries, there are interventions that are done that can actually be more harmful than helpful. And so as good clinicians, you need to be able to fully say that this treatment is positive and their positive outweighs the negatives. So we need to do the same thing with therapy. We need to be able to say that the positives of therapy outweigh the potential negatives. But we don't really have an understanding of the negatives in therapy. I think especially in the culture, we don't see any downside because you're not cutting into a person, you're not giving them a drug that interacts with their bodies, so therapy can't be harmful. But Abigail Shrier says, well, it's a medical intervention, and so it actually does have some downsides. And this is something that we talk about in our counselor education. So I think might be not quite nail on the head that I do think in popular culture it's a very true statement that we don't understand that mental health treatment can make conditions worse. And we've seen that in the literature, that there are times where a person goes through treatment and it's actually worse for them than it's better. We see this especially when we're working with trauma, and we're going to get into that way more in a minute. But when you dredge up a lot of trauma, sometimes things get worse before they get better, or the treatment for that trauma isn't the best treatment and can actually re-traumatize a person. So we need to have an understanding that we are wading into people's mental health with care, and that we're able to say, this is the best treatment for this condition, but there are some caveats. It could get worse. There could be some downsides to it. And we as a culture don't understand that. We think that therapy is just a, one-size-fits-all treatment, that we should just send everybody to therapy for everything that ails them. And she's actually saying that, no, it can do a lot more harm than it does good. And I definitely think I agree with that to a certain extent, and I think we need to explore that. I think we need to think through the role that therapy should play in our lives and in culture. But I do think she does overstep her bounds a little bit, and I'll explain more of that later. So to explain this point, she talks about how there are actually more mental health problems now with our youth despite more therapists. So we see depression rates on the rise. We see anxiety rates on the rise. We see all kinds of mental health problems on the rise in our youth. This is something that's well established in the literature. Study after study is showing that teenagers are not okay. And that's her subtitle of the book, Why the Kids Are Not Okay. And so, despite there being more therapists. So what is going on here? Why do we have more mental health therapists and yet our teens are getting worse? So is there a link there? Is therapy actually causing our teens to have worse mental health outcomes than they should? She also talks about how rumination produces more negative emotions. So rumination is where you're thinking over and over again on something. So if you're paying attention to your negative emotions more, you're going to experience more negative emotions. Like, for example, if you start to think about yellow cars, all of a sudden all you notice are yellow cars, and then you don't notice the red cars or the blue cars or the green cars. So you're hyper fixated on your negative emotions, so you're going to experience more, and it's going to heighten them, and it's kind of becomes this positive feedback cycle where you're thinking about the negative emotions, so it causes more negative emotions. And this is something that we see. She mentioned the case of hypochondria. This was something that was really interesting to me that I didn't know before, that hypochondria is not necessarily that someone is making up pain in their mind or making up a health condition in their mind. What's happening is that they are experiencing a legitimate feeling in their body. They're experiencing legitimate pain, legitimate feeling of maybe perhaps illness or discomfort, but they're so hyper focused on it that their experience of that becomes heightened to a point that's unhealthy. So you might actually have some back pain, for example, but if you have hypochondria, you're so hyper aware of that pain that it becomes outsized to what is actually, more objectively happening in your body. Or you have, a twinge in your stomach and you think, oh, it's stomach cancer. So you're so hyper focused on it that really you kind of are experiencing that feeling of pain. And that's what's difficult with pain. And that is a subject for another podcast of how pain is subjective and how the body and the mind work together in the experience of that. It's very interesting. But anyways, so this hyper focus on our negative emotions can cause more negative emotions. She also talks about how happiness has become a goal of ours. So when we think about our lives in culture and why we might go to a therapist is that I'm not happy. And so my goal in life is to become happy. So I go to a therapist to help me be happy. But we find over and over again in the literature that the pursuit of happiness as a goal in your life actually does not produce happiness. What produces happiness is when you're focused on the well-being of other people. When you have something that your life is for, a goal that your life is for that is other-oriented, that is actually what produces happiness rather than having your own happiness as a goal. It's a very interesting paradox. I've talked about that before on my podcast and linked to a study about that. But that's something that happens in therapy often is when your goal is, how can I be happy? Paired with this sort of hyper awareness of negative emotions, it actually produces more negative emotions and reduces the chance that you're actually going to have some happiness in your life. So then you have this sort of learned dependence on therapists. So you have to endlessly go to therapy because you're trying to produce this happiness and you're trying to reduce this negative emotion, and yet the therapy is actually working the opposite way. So that's her argument there. She also talks about social emotional learning and how this has pervaded schools, and it's become something that in every class you have all these check-ins about your negative emotions. And, when your teacher asks you, how are you feeling today? And we're going around the room and everyone is talking about something, what's rewarded is not the kids who are, oh, I'm having a great day. That's just kind of like, oh, well, that's great for you. Let's move on to the next person. But the kids who get the most attention are the kids that are going through really hard times. And so that's incentivizing negative emotions, and it's rewarding that in a way that can produce more negative emotions in kids that might not otherwise feel that way. Secondly, you are in a group of people that you wouldn't naturally talk about the difficult things in your life in. They're not truly your community. They're more of a network. So they're not the people that are really in your life, that are living your life as, alongside you. They're people that once you leave this class, you're not, once you graduate, you're never going to see them again. And you wouldn't naturally bring them into your life, and they have no stake in your life, and yet you're sharing these really negative things, and you're hearing these negative things from your classmates. So you're here to learn math, you're here to learn science, and yet the beginning of your class is all about how you're classmate is their parents are going through a divorce. So what are you going to be thinking about? What's going to be consuming your day? Is it going to be focusing on the task of learning, or is it going to be naturally and rightly empathy for your classmate? And that's not to say that we shouldn't be caring, that our teachers shouldn't have sort of a mind of holistic understanding of a child, but we shouldn't be sort of digging into these deep emotional things in a setting and in a time that isn't conducive to actually producing positive emotion as a result of that sharing. So we need to be mindful in the way that we engage mental health in our schools, and that's not happening. It's just kind of, again, her point is this one size fits all of, we just need to understand our emotions more. We need to let our emotions lead our lives and lead our day, kind of have this free-for-all, emotional, unbagging of everything. And that more therapy is automatically better and more talk of emotions is automatically better, which isn't necessarily the truth. She also talks about trauma and how there has been I personally think that there's good and there's bad that's come out of this, but the more that we are aware of emotional trauma, the more that it can be co-opted and used in a negative way or treated in a way that's not effective. So she talked a lot about the narrative of The Body Keeps the Score, which was an extremely influential book, which talks about how our physical body has sort of a memory of the trauma that we've been through, that we may not consciously remember in our minds, but our bodies experience these negative emotions. So for example, you might be in a situation where you are interacting with a large male and your body gets tense and you start sweating and you're physically just freaking out. Your body's in pain. You start to feel these sort of physical symptoms, and yet cognitively you are not feeling that way. Your memories of your trauma of being perhaps harmed by a large male are not coming to mind, but your body is reacting to this trigger. And so therefore we have these memories that are present in our bodies that our minds might not be aware of. She makes the point that this notion of this kind of trauma memory, this body memory of our trauma, is actually just kind of a repackaged version of repressed memory that has been largely discredited in the field. To explain that a little bit further, in the 70s, well, really going all the way back to Freud, there was a sense of these unconscious memories that we're repressing, that we're pushing away so that we're not remembering them, but they really did happen to us. But in the 70s, that started to become very popular, and into the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of court cases where there were criminal charges being brought against people based on the eyewitness accounts of people who went through therapy and, quote, recovered repressed memories. There were some very famous psychologists who would interview people and sort of uncover these terrible things that had happened to them. And there were people that were actually convicted and sentenced to life sentences based on the eyewitness accounts of these repressed memory cases that were later objectively determined to be false. And she draws the connection between the people that are kind of promoting this sort of body memory, this trauma awareness in our bodies, are some of the very people that were expert witnesses for these repressed memory cases to try and wrongfully convict these people. Now, I think that this is, to me, an interesting connection that I'd like to look more into, because I've read these books and they're very persuasive, and I think they do have some good science behind them. However, I think maybe the way that we interpret them and use them might need to have some moderation. But that is something that I would like to do more research on. I'm not as familiar with the history of that, and I'm not as familiar with maybe some of the criticisms and downside of these sort of trauma kings, she calls them. But yeah, so that was something that was really interesting. My initial reaction, this is completely opinion, is that, I think that can be explained by that we are sort of aware in our minds that this is triggering, but we're not it's not immediately in our head. So like it is coming from our brain. It's not necessarily that our muscles remember this trauma that has been done to us. I think that our brain has been conditioned to, to see certain things as a threat. So our mind has learned associations between different situations or different types of people or different things happening. We've learned to associate that thing equals danger in our mind. And so our body, our brain is reacting to this perceived threat by putting your body in a state of fight or flight so that it's ready to respond to a danger that might actually be there. So I think it's less of this like repressed memory and more of you have learned to, it's more of learning. It's more of association where you've learned to associate certain things with danger. So that's the way that your body's responding. So I think that's my initial reaction to kind of moderate and explain the way that, we're seeing our bodies. It's not in question that our bodies really do react to trauma triggers, and we may not, at times where we may not cognitively be aware of that being triggered. But I think, so I think that might moderate some of how to conceptualize those results. And yet it's not repressed trauma. It's not these false memories that are being implanted at the suggestion of a therapist. It's things that are really there, like true things that are really there that your brain has learned to associate. And so the key is to unpair those things, is to realize what associations have been falsely made by your mind, and to unlearn certain thoughts and behaviors and connections. But anyways, and then her final point is she discusses the problems with gentle parenting. And she talks about how children are being coddled nowadays, how they're never told the word no, and they're never allowed to experience the real world for what it is. They're not allowed to get hurt physically and emotionally. They're constantly protected by helicopter parents so that when they experience the real world, so when they have to go to school and there's a class of 20 people, and so the teacher has to have some order and has to say no to certain kids and can't endlessly entertain what they want to do, then they are unprepared for that. And then they have problems in school. They are acting up because they have not been prepared for this situation. And then they end up being diagnosed with some kind of oppositional defiance or ADHD, and then they're drugged. And so she is kind of drawing this connection between a very permissive style of parenting and what that could end up as getting kids into the pipeline of overdiagnosis and overmedication that I think most people recognize is a problem, in our country. So that's kind of her main points and what she has put out there in her arguments. There's a lot more to the book. I really recommend you read it, whether you are hearing me talk about it and you are angry about it and you think it's absolute bunk, or you're starting to agree with it. I think that you need to look at this yourself. There's a lot more that she presents, and I think that you should engage and make up your own mind about it. But my reactions here, so the good points that I think that she's made is that there are situations where therapy can be harmful. I've seen it myself where, and this is something we learn a lot in school, is that a lot of times when you start to address issues that you've been ignoring in the past, things can get worse before they get better. You can start to feel worse because you're actually engaging in these negative emotions instead of trying to avoid them. So things can feel worse before they get better. However, you can have a treatment where it doesn't get better and it's just endlessly getting worse. I think she does have a point where if the therapy that you're doing is all about endlessly dredging up these negative emotions, it absolutely can be harmful. And I've noticed this, as I'm gauging week to week with some of my clients, where we're getting into this rut where all you're doing is coming to therapy to complain about your life and so you're looking throughout your week, you're looking for all of the ways that you're struggling, all of the things that are bad and negative. And so then you just kind of get in this rut of negativity. And that's what happens a lot with anxiety and depression is you have, I don't know, what's the opposite of rosy colored glasses? Sort of like gray colored glasses, where you're seeing the world through this lens of everything is bad and everything is terrible, which is something that already exists in depression. And so if your therapy is just sort of endlessly indulging this, I think that can really be harmful. I think that's an excellent point. But what the goal of therapy is to engage these negative things, to face up to them. A lot of people try to avoid them, and that actually creates more problems. So you're engaging in negative emotions, you're understanding negative emotions, but you are engaging them in a way that is appropriate, where you have the tools to deal with them. So, for example, if I treat a client with trauma, I don't start with having them give me a detailed description of what their trauma is, or of what happened. Like, that can potentially re-traumatize them because they aren't equipped to face up to that yet. First, what we need to do, and maybe they might give me a little overview of what happened just so I can understand and be on the same page, but we're not going to engage in this really detailed live through it type of recounting of their traumatic event before I give them the tools to deal with it in a way that allows them to process it in a productive manner. So, for example, we would work on some self-soothing exercises. We would work on some cognitive ways of conceptualizing difficult things. We would work on some different therapeutic tools, really. And then we would start to engage in the trauma and bring it out of storage and deal with it with strength in a positive way, where you're not getting flooded, where you're able to see the meaning and the hope that exists in the midst of this trauma, and you're dealing with it, and then you're putting it away. So you can unlearn those feelings of helplessness and the trauma, and you can work through these bad reactions and have more of a sense of safety in your life and of meaning and control. Another thing that I think that is a really good point is sort of this understanding of like fad diagnoses and over-diagnosing people that are actually not quote sick. So I think, when you go through a hard time in your life, you are not necessarily, it's not necessarily at the level of pathology. And I think we are treating people as if they're sick when they're just going through normal things of life and they're struggling with those things. However, my and I guess we're getting into criticism here, is that I think she makes a false category or a false division between people who are sick and people who are well mentally. It's not that easy of a division, because when we see sort of, of course, everyone can imagine severe depression to where you're suicidal. Everyone can imagine schizophrenia where you're having hallucinations. Everyone can imagine these really pronounced mental health disorders. However, it's really more of a spectrum than it is, these neat categories and boxes. So when I've gone through my life where I've been dealing with something that's really difficult, where I've had symptoms of depression, but should I be labeled with major depressive disorder? Well, ideally, if we're sticking with the literal diagnostics, then probably not. The problem is that I think therapy actually can be helpful, just getting through and learning good positive tools for how to deal with negative emotion before it gets to the level of pathology. And our current health system does not have a way of facilitating that without private pay, which is astronomically expensive. And so what often happens is people come in, they self-report these symptoms, they get diagnosed with whatever. And especially when we have fad diagnoses where everyone, they see on TikTok, oh, hey, there's this new diagnosis. Oh, I think I see that in myself, so I must have this thing. And so I think, I don't know. That's maybe something for another podcast as well. But I think we need to have a more nuanced view of healthy versus sick that I don't think has an appreciation for. And I do think that there is a role in therapeutic tools in, someone who's not sick, because we want to prevent people from getting to the point where they're having psychosis. We want people to prevent them from getting to the point of suicidality. And so helping them learn tools that maybe they didn't learn from their family of origin in order to help them through life is valid and is important. But it just needs to be done well. It needs to be done in a way that equips people and allows them to be resilient and to be self-sufficient, and instead of endlessly dependent on a therapist to just talk about their bad emotions. So in essence, there is a good therapy, and there are good therapists out there. I think she goes too far the other way in painting all therapy as bad. I think what the problem really is the ideology behind therapy. And I think that's what really needs to be in the crosshairs. So really, like, our field needs to be reformed, not reduced, is I think what the real problem is. But she kind of throws everything, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, is I think what's happening in her idea. And she does say that there are good therapists out there. She interviews some people who have a really good perspective. And so she's fair in that way, but I think she overstates her point, which happens a lot, I think, with journalistic writing, because you want people to be interested and you want people to be engaged. And the real nuanced truth is often doesn't get people to do things, right? And doesn't get sort of the type of action that is needed to make reforms. And so I kind of understand sort of this overstatement of therapy being bad. And yeah, so it's hard to say. I mean, I agree with it, and I think there is some nuance, but perhaps we need to emphasize the negatives in order to get reform and to get change in the field of therapy. Yeah, I think it's just really some interesting assertions about the repressed memory cases, and something that I would like to do more research on. And perhaps that can be another topic for another, I'm saying that a lot this time, another topic for another podcast there. Now I'd like to talk about some of the criticisms that I haven't talked about already. I've talked about several of them actually already. So let's just cover some of the ones that I haven't talked about. So first of all, she notes that as more mental health practitioners increase, the rates of anxiety and depression in teenagers has increased as well. And she uses that to say that therapy is bad, therapy is causing these things. However, correlation does not prove causation. It could just be that because anxiety and depression are on the rise, there are more therapists needed, and so there's more of a push for people to become therapists. It could be cultural forces at work that are causing both things, that are causing both therapists to be on the rise and mental health things on the rise. I think that's kind of more, my initial reaction is that's probably more what's going on. That it's sort of the same ideology that is sort of endlessly wallowing in negative emotion is pushing for more therapists. Not necessarily that therapy is causing those things, but that, an ideological push is causing both of those things. But we need to be careful. We need to actually say that this thing causes this thing. So we need more research to prove that therapy is causing these increases in negative mental health outcomes with adolescents. I do like her point that the prevailing explanations for why teens are struggling nowadays are things like smartphone, COVID happening, and climate change. But the thing is that there are other generations that have been through a lot worse things than that. So I was just talking a few weeks ago with my husband's grandmother, who is 90, oh my gosh, 97. And she was telling me that she remembers walking down the street of her neighborhood and seeing on the houses these stars on the windows. And the stars represented that was a house where they had lost a young man in the war. So imagine living your life, A, going through the trauma of fighting in a war, but B, back home as a teenager, you're living in this culture where daily you're walking by reminders that your future could be death, and that friends that you've had, family members that you've had, are passing. And that, just that example in itself can show us that is a much more immediate existential threat than, quote, the climate change issue. And COVID, where there's loneliness is awful, and isolation is absolutely awful, and it is, people use it as a form of torture. However, there were people being actually tortured and physically tortured, living through wars, living through abuse, living through a lot worse things in past generations, and yet we did not see these same kinds of spikes in suicidality and depression. So what exactly is going on nowadays? Yeah, I think we need to explore that more. My opinion is that which I think she gets kind of right in this book, is that kids are not prepared on how to confront and deal with negative emotions. And I don't want to pick on gentle parenting too much because I do think that it's overstated. There is a difference between permissive parenting and gentle parenting. So the permissive parenting is where you just kind of let your kid do whatever they want, and you live your life endlessly just trying to please them in every possible way. And I don't think that's what gentle parenting is saying. So I think we need to be careful not to strawman that position. But our culture has, by and large, been pushing this, is often doing this more permissive style of parenting, where the kid runs the house and they are not ever told no, and they are not allowed to experience the negative outcomes of their behavior. And there is a sense of sort of this helicopter parenting and this overemphasis on safety that is not equipping children to face the real world. However, I think she goes much too far the other way and sort of over idealizes the past. So she talks about like, oh yeah, I was allowed to walk everywhere in town when I was 5 years old, which, yeah, the kid might learn some resiliency skills, but the kid is legitimately in danger at that point. I mean, there were people who were molested and who were abused because their parents weren't keeping a good enough eye on them, and we don't want that for our children. There are legitimate safety things. There are times where lives were lost because of this. So there's legitimate things to be concerned about out in the world, and we do need to be concerned with the safety of our children and not just let them run all over town. We don't have a culture, we do not live in times where that would be an okay thing to do for our children. I also think she idolizes the 50s and how great things were back then. I think that's something that is often touted by conservatives, where, yeah, there's this sort of magical idealized view of the 50s being this time of the nuclear family being strong and everyone's happy and kids are cared for and everything is great. But what we're not saying is that things weren't perfect then. We had a lot of fathers who were distant and traumatized. We had a lot of mothers that were drugged out. There was a lot of things that weren't great in the 50s. And so we need to stop looking at a particular time frame in our country as our measuring stick for what is good. And we need to ground ourselves in something that is more permanent and more objective. And I would say that would be looking at the kingdom and looking at the vision that God has for his people after he makes all things new again. So we need to ground ourselves in that as sort of our vision for what should be, and to have that sort of be our center, what we're searching for, instead of this hearkening back to a made-up version of what happened in the 50s. So, yeah, I think that's a problem. Another problem, yeah, is her pushing too far to the other extreme, where it's just kind of this rub some dirt in it, idea of just be okay. Just stop it. Just stop being sad. And just focus on what you have to do. Focus on your tasks and get things done, and then things will just magically be okay. And that's not how it works. That's not what happens. When you repress your negative emotions, sure, there is a sense in which you avoid the danger of overindulging your negative emotions, so we're drumming up more negative emotions than there are, but then you can often repress them into behaviors that are not good. You can repress them into addiction, you can repress them into negative ways of dealing with other people, into anger. Everyone has a boiling point, and you have to have this balance of being able to face up to your negative emotions, to, yes, take them out, to look them in the face, but not leave it there, not just leave it in this sort of wallowing place. You need to then figure out, how can I deal with it? How can I process this to a point where I can be functional? And so that's where, yeah, she jumps to the other extreme, and I think we need to be careful of telling people it's all in your head. It's not. That's been well established in the research. We've seen that, and so we need to have some nuance there, and to, yeah, I think that's a legitimate criticism of her point. So yeah, a lot in this book that is extremely excellent, very thought-provoking. I think well-deserved discussion happening surrounding this book. I recommend that you read it yourself and that you kind of think through both of these. Where can you find that you agree with her? Where can you find that you disagree? Have some good, thoughtful engagement with it. Yeah, and I hope it's a good journey for you. If you liked what you heard here and you'd like to hear more, I have an e-course on udemy.com where I go through how to understand psychology from the framework of systematic theology. So I go through theology proper, I go through, soteriology, through eschatology, through all of these things and what they have to say about counseling and how we should understand the human mind and behavior in light of our understanding of God himself. So yeah, check that out. The link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.